Hi, everybody, and welcome to our presentation today by Dr. Bonnie Badenoch on the Integrated and Mindful Therapist. A couple of introductory comments. I was talking to Bonnie earlier today. It was 30 years ago that I started graduate school, and my first advising professor was fresh back from Russia. He'd been studying under one of the premier neurobiologists of the 20th century, was Alexander Luria. And so my first courses in graduate school 30 years ago were neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. Ooh, bracing. In some ways, the courses felt familiar to me because I'd grown up in a home of, my father was a biologically oriented psychiatrist, and it felt like a familiar language. But my own draw to psychology was through the humanities, through art and philosophy, and it was just from a different background, and so it was really hard for me to get into. I remember we would view slides of sheep brains. That's how we learned the structures of the brain. And that course was really the beginning curriculum for me. And then for the next 20 years or so, I really kind of dove into studying psychotherapy and found psychotherapies from self-psychology through infant research and attachment theory that really appealed to me in terms of understanding human relationship, what goes on in therapy, as well as in our development. But it was only in the last decade or so that became introduced to what's referred now to as the subdiscipline of interpersonal neurobiology. So now 30 years later, the sense of having come full circle from a very kind of left-brained approach to neuroscience to really beginning to integrate, for example, affect and emotion. That wasn't a part, it was a very intellectual approach to neuropsychology 30 years ago. And now there's so much focus on affective regulation and how we do that for one another. Also, I think, coming from a more of an artistic background, to find someone, and Dr. Bonnie Badenoch, who I'll say a little bit more about in a minute, really is able to integrate the science of neurobiology with, I feel like, an artistic, poetic, feelingful perspective that you guys will see right away. Very different than my initial imprinting in neuropsychology. And I think primarily what I want to say is the focus in neuroscience on the effect of our interconnectivity, our relationships with each other, and to begin to find how it is that neuroscience can really specify what's going on in our relationships developmentally, in our relationships in psychotherapy, and as Bonnie's going to talk about today, our moving into being therapists ourselves. So I'd say the education and training of us as psychotherapists to even look at that process neurobiologically that's all new in the last 30 years. There's no one that I've ever known that is more qualified and more skilled at presenting from this perspective than Dr. Bonnie Badenoch. So I just want to move to introducing you, and I'm really, really happy to have you here.
Thank you very much for inviting me, everyone who has extended an invitation to your wonderful program. Just in hearing a little bit about it, I really love your openness to incorporating whatever will work most to produce the most confident, comfortable, well-integrated interns moving out into the world. And having been an intern, I really know what that's like, and I know a number of you have too, you know, so the better the grounding, the better it will be. And I think that neuroscience really has a lot to say now, is beginning, we know enough now to have it refine how we think about the activity of doing therapy, and then from there about how do we train people to be therapists, because that's really where it starts, only probably even one step back before that, and that is how do those of you that are involved in actually creating the programs, how do you create the environment that allows a different experience to emerge so that there can be this grounding. So it's really expanding circles, I think, that we go through. So my introduction to this came through hearing Dan Siegel speak in 2003. I had been mainly a trauma therapist for about 14 years at that point. And we were getting good results with our people. I'd had really good therapy myself, and I was using that as my foundation for being able to help other people, along with my education. But I think I learned the most in my therapy because it was experiential and it was inside me, so it was part of me. So then I heard Dan speak, and literally the hair stood up on the back of my neck because it was like, oh my gosh, this is why this stuff works. And so it was like taking a camera that had been a little out of focus and just turning that so that everything was suddenly in really clear focus about what was happening in the brain and the mind of the people that we were with, but also what was happening in our own brains and minds. And so we had a nonprofit here in Irvine. I live in Portland, Oregon now, but back then we had Center for Hope and Healing here in Irvine. And I brought it back to my interns, and we began to puddle our way for the next 5 years through all of this. And what I saw was that, that the interns became much more confident and calm and able to hold the clients that were coming to them. We had a tough population at our agency. We were choosing for personality disorders, and we were working with therapists who had committed ethical violations and just all kinds of really difficult stuff. And so as we would watch their holding capacity and their calmness and their confidence go up as they learned more about the brain and about their own brains and what was happening for them in therapy. So out of all of that came the writing of the first book, the Brainwise Therapist book, and for which I just felt I got a lot of support from Dan Siegel in doing that, which was really nice. But what it's about is the application of these principles to the practice of therapy and now to the practice of training therapists is hopefully the next wonderful frontier. So where I thought, this is because an hour to me feels frightening. Honestly, I'm used to talking in 6 and 8 hour blocks of time. So I was thinking, like, what do I tell them about neuroscience, you know? So I thought what I would do, you have that one sheet of paper that has these are 8 core principles that I've called. This isn't anybody's list but mine. There's probably 30 core principles of interpersonal neurobiology if we really worked on it. But these are the 8 that have seemed most relevant to me for the practice of therapy and the practice of training therapists. So I thought we'd go through these and think about what they mean for us as human beings and as therapists. And then really talk a little bit about, well, what would a training program that incorporates this stuff actually look like? What would it look like and feel like, and where would you have to start to do this, and all of that kind of thing. So the biggest discovery that we made as we went through this process was that 2 things went hand in hand. And that is that the more deeply we got immersed in clarity about the neuroscience, the greater we could have an expanded compassion for people, because we could actually see why they were doing what they were doing. Their behaviors didn't seem stupid or irrational or anything else anymore, or to be judged, but they could really be understood. And so this broadened the compassion that we were able to have. And we know from the research that the single most important factor in therapeutic efficacy is non-judgmental acceptance. Broadly, it's empathy, but of all the empathic factors, non-judgmental acceptance is the biggest factor. And that doesn't mean not judging them with your words. That means being able to hold them with a non-judging mind and heart, because you actually can see where this stuff is coming from, and it doesn't just seem weird. You know, it makes sense. It begins to really make sense. And so that then allowed for this broadening of compassion, but then at the same time, with a lot of compassion, you can get really drained and wind up feeling burned out and like you're carrying everybody home with you at night. And so somehow having our feet solidly also in the science seemed to steady us enough, though we weren't getting washed away by the compassion that was increasing. So, and we didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, we literally were a living laboratory. You know, I'd bring this stuff back and say, guess what I learned from Dan? Okay, so how does this apply to so-and-so and so-and-so, and how is it applying to you? And it took us about 5 years to get it kind of pretty thoroughly integrated so that we were seeing people as they came in, also seeing their brains and minds as part of just the way we saw. It wasn't like a sidelight anymore of, oh yeah, and they also have this going on in their brain, but seeing that as a thread that was woven into everything that we did. So it takes time. So patience with ourselves and everything is really important as we go into this, because it's not easy stuff, and it takes patience and it takes perseverance to get into it, both internally and also just in terms of the program and all of that. But boy, the dividends are quite amazing. So we'll just dive in now to these 8 principles. So the first one says that early history matters. There have been a lot of schools of therapy where you don't even take history, you don't think about history, it just kind of lies there in the background. Well, what we know is that when a person comes into the room, including us, it's always this. It's not just the person comes into the room and we're this like object that's sitting there. The person comes into the room and we come into the room, but we're carrying what are called the implicit templates of relationship that we learned before we were 2 years old. as modified by healing experiences we've had since if that relationship wasn't so good at the beginning of life. So we are carrying these things, and these two attachment histories meet one another and have a huge amount to say about what happens next in that realm. And when we're not aware of what that attachment history is in us and we can't see it in the other person, it way increases the odds that we will begin to be swept up by our client's attachment history and carried off down the stream with them. Just to give you an example, I've done a fair amount of work with people who have reactive attachment disorder as adults, which comes from being so hated and rejected that your attachment system wires backwards, so that every time someone approaches you with care, you have to get away from them as quickly as possible, which presents a very difficult dilemma. So what happens then is this person goes to a therapist who is trying to listen to them tell their story. And this person says, I'm garbage, I'm trash, I'm a horrible human being, I should be dead, which is what you're going to hear often for months and sometimes years before any of this can shift. And yet they see a person who almost invariably has a very serviceful and giving life, and that everybody else thinks is a really wonderful, if very anxious human being. So if you're coming from a cognitive viewpoint, what you're going to do is feel frustrated and annoyed and everything else as you try to talk this person out of how they're seeing themselves and get them into better reality testing. But this stuff is ironed in from birth, and the person cannot go there through cognitive means. They can only go there through long-standing nurturant means where their goodness and is being reflected to them over a long period of time so the deep right hemisphere can change. So most of these people that I've worked with that have reactive attachment disorder have been through 10 or 15 therapists, all of whom has either fired them or they've fired them because they just got so frustrated because their inner implicit story of attachment doesn't match their outer life. Now that's a fairly extreme example, but there's shadings all along the continuum. Now for us, if we came from very distant parents and our clients bring some emotional richness into the room, we may have a lot of difficulty because our brains were wired by those parents connecting to that emotional richness. So we may pull back, we may simply divert and think we want to talk about something else and become real directive in the therapy. But our attachment style comes in that way. If we come from a chaotic background of various shadings, a little chaotic or a lot chaotic, then when the client's intensity comes into the room, we can dysregulate and either feel like we have to manage, we might dissociate, we might just freak out with them, and now you have two anxious people in the room. So nobody's regulating anybody. So it's so important that we take history seriously, our early attachment history, and there's so much good neuroscience. I mean, I could give you a 10-page bibliography to corroborate everything we know about how the brain gets wired up early and how those circuits persist throughout life unless other healing experiences come in to change them. So that's one piece. So we'll talk a little later about, so what does that mean for a program? But it certainly means that if we wind up with any kind of model that says that history isn't important, that we would want to question that, I think. The second thing is that the body is part of every memory. So whenever we have an experience, we have a bodily experience with it, we have a nervous system experience with it, we have an emotional experience with it, and out of that comes the thought experience, not the other way around. The implicit, this implicit stuff, which is the body and the emotions, is what generates the thoughts. And again, there's really good science behind this. And this is why when I was coming here today, I was thinking, I'm going to just say all this stuff, and are they going to think I'm just making this up? But I can provide you with a great bibliography that will, be able to substantiate these things that I'm just stating as general principles. So if we come into therapy believing that what we mainly need to do is talk to our clients, addressing mainly the left hemisphere, and pay attention to their talk to us, we're missing about 90% of the communication that's happening in the room, and especially about the attachment relationship, which really isn't able to come out in words a lot of the time, but comes out in our style of relating to one another. And that we will feel in this resonance between our bodies. How many of you have heard of mirror neurons? Do you know what those are? Yeah, mirror neurons cause us to create an internalization of the other person. We create a representation of their emotional state and their intention, as well as their bodily movement within us. And so we are constantly resonating with one another. So when I have a client come into the room and they're anxious, there's a way that my anxiety, if I'm really resonating with them, will probably feel a little rise too. But that can be held as information. Now, they may be talking really calmly. But so if I'm not attending to my body, then I'm missing what they're actually trying to tell me. The words are relatively unimportant a lot of the time. And trying to correct things that are occurring through the right hemisphere by left hemisphere talk is not possible for deep, long-lasting change, which we'll get to in a minute. We know the way the circuits run in the brain, the left hemisphere cannot talk the right hemisphere limbic system out of anything because there's no connections between from the left to the right like that. Another process has to intervene. So again, this is why I would love to now spend 3 hours talking about that. So we need to begin to learn to listen to our body, to develop a different set of ears. If we can listen to our own bodies really well, we'll be able to do that with our clients as well. If we can't hear our own bodies, we really don't have the ear to hear it very well with our clients either. So getting used to listening that way and being really present is very helpful and very essential. So then here's a piece of really good news. Brains do change all the time. Your brain's changing right now as we're here together. So is mine. I'm internalizing you. I'm feeling the warmth of this room. I'm creating new memories. When I think of being here, I'll have this kind of warm feeling of being with, people that feel very comfortable to be with, and all of that. So our brains do change all of the time, which is very, very good news that we can share with clients and with ourselves, and that healing just about anything that isn't organically based, like a genetic difficulty or something, is very, very possible. And so if we carry that certainty within us, usually because we've had our own depth of change, then we bring that certainty to our clients and provide this really solid structure of hope for them into which they can move their whole process. But we aren't going to know that if we know it just in our left hemisphere, like I've now told you, we have neuroplasticity is the word for that. Our brains are plastic. Doesn't sound good, does it? Our brains are capable of change all the time. If you only know that in your left hemisphere, it doesn't impact how you carry it into the room. You have to have your own experience of how your mind can change your brain, repeated long enough that you go, this really works, and you know it through your whole being. Then you carry it into the room, not as a thought, but as an experience. And that's what our clients most need, is to have new experience through the way we are with them, much more than talk. There's been a lot of research done on when people get through, really have had tough life experience and they successfully get through therapy. And they ask them at the end, what do you remember? What they remember is the day their therapist got a tear in the eye when they told them something, the day they had a belly laugh together, the day that they just felt deeply understood. They never remember our brilliant interventions, all the smart things we said to them, all this great verbal wisdom that we bring is on nobody's radar. Nobody's radar. So it's that connection that changes the way the brain is wired. That's the greatest agent of neuroplasticity, is the relationship. And again, neuroscience bears this out. So we're always rewiring one another's brains, and in the presence of empathy, we're literally drawing neural circuitry together that has been apart. So it's exciting that our brains are that capable of being healed and that we're really not stuck with stuff. Because until even the last 5 years, these implicit attachment memories were thought to be permanent, that once they went into long-term storage, it was impossible to change them. And in the last 5 years, there have been many experiments done now that show that under certain conditions, even these deep, oldest memories can change. So if we know those rules for change, and we've applied them to ourselves, then we'll be able to bring a lot more efficiency to the therapy process. Now, I'm not somebody who says, how fast can this therapy be? Because that is a societal injunction, I think, and an insurance company mandate that has very little to do with how relationships actually work, which is for us to get deep long-term change, we need to settle into a relationship enough to open up this deep stuff and have it be healed. So I've never been in any big rush to push therapy, how fast can it go, beyond wanting it to be as quick as is respectful for the relationship, so suffering is less. That's a concern. How do we relieve suffering as quickly as we can? But not how do we get people in and out of the door in 6 sessions. That has nothing to do with how our minds work, or our bodies work, or how relationships work. So, again, I'm a little rabid about this one. I'm running up against many societal forces at this point, I realize. But I think it is something we want to think about. If you think about your personal relationships, how don't they just deepen and they deepen, and you get more and more able to be with one another in a deep way, and that begins to be a healing experience for you. Alan Shore, who's one of the leading theoreticians in this interpersonal neurobiology field, has done some research, or anyway, from Alan I've heard this based on research, which is that if an insecurely attached person marries a securely attached person, it takes about 5 years for the resonance between the two of them to bring this person into secure attachment. 5 years. So it's not unreasonable to think that people who have attachment issues, which is almost everybody who walks in the door for therapy, actually, it takes a lot to get you to shell out your dough to come in. You've got to be in some kind of significant relational pain usually to get in that door. People don't, unless somebody's coming for parenting classes or something, but most people are coming because they're really hurting. And a lot of that goes back to these early implicit attachment patterns. So to change those, it takes depth, it takes time, it takes developing relationship to rewire many of the circuits in the brain. So we'll see if any of this science gradually begins to even change the way insurance companies think about things. I'm not holding my breath. But one of the reasons we formed our own little community was, our own little agency, was because we wanted to do things the way we wanted to do them, believing this stuff even before the neuroscience came along. So we didn't get involved in managed healthcare, period. We just took lower fees, and it all worked out fine. So there are also ways around this problem, but they just require some creative thinking so that we don't get caught up in system imperatives. And it's getting worse from what I hear from friends as far as the system's imperatives. As there's less money, there's more anxiety about getting things done quicker, and so nothing happens. Or wounding happens. I mean, sometimes those short-term relationships are worse than nothing at all because it's another abandonment when it's over, especially for children. They just begin to bond with somebody and it's like done. And that then tends to replicate that sort of thing. If there was a soapbox to be stood on, I'd be standing on it about this one, I'll tell you. I mean, I think what it would have meant for me had I been allowed 6 sessions of therapy. I mean, I come from a pretty abusive background. Nothing would have happened. I wouldn't even begun to feel safe in 6 sessions to even begin to approach what was actually going on inside of me. So the next principle is is that neural integration lies at the root of well-being, and that we can nurture neural integration in relationship. So let me just give you one example of that. So this is my right hemisphere of my brain. Dan Siegel's hand model, for which we are all so grateful. I don't even have a model of the brain in my room because I carry it with me. And then after we do it, my clients carry it with them, and they'll go, I think it's in here. I'm struggling with this. I think this circuit isn't attached to this circuit because I yelled at my partner again. And, it's like, great, And it gives them some regulation because they can look at their brains. And so instead of just being completely caught up in the experience, a part of them is able to say, I think this is what's happening. And that's regulating, that's calming the nervous system through understanding. So it's very useful. Well, so this is the limbic system, way in the center of the brain, which is kind of the heart of where we store a lot of the very difficult things that happen in childhood and through life. I mean, it continues to wire up through life, but those first 2 years kind of set the tenor of what's going to go on here. And then, as wrapping the brain around the circuits that are right here behind the eye and can connect to that, this region, if this is the 2 hemispheres of the brain, this is like the middle prefrontal region right here. So if these circuits, the middle prefrontal circuits, are not well attached to the limbic region, so that it's more like this as opposed to like this. Not that your brain really flies apart, but that the connections aren't there. Yeah, never does my skull actually fly up. But when they are not well connected, we lose the capacity for attuned communication. We lose the capacity for empathy. We lose the capacity to make a rationally based, thought-through response to anything. We're just going on pure reactivity. We lose the capacity to have a regulated nervous system, and we lose the capacity to have the ability to calm our emotions. Intuition is out the window, and morality is greatly reduced. We're pretty much scared all the time. That's just two little sets of circuits in the brain. Integrated, we have those capacities. Disintegrated, they're all gone. So when somebody says, I made up my mind I was not going to go have this affair, and here I am having this affair, what's happened is that their limbic region has a need to have this affair that's stronger than the capacity of the left hemisphere decision to manage it, because these circuits are not connected. Whenever people are doing things that are against their conscious intention, it's because their limbic region has run away with them. It functions 100 times faster than this integrated circuit. So if you have this crying need to be closely connected to somebody because you didn't feel closely connected as a child, and this wonderful man or woman approaches you, and you just feel all this blossoming of wonderful stuff, with or without alcohol, you are probably out the door and down the road with them, even while your brain over here is going, I have a wife at home. Because this is not connected to this unless this is connected. So then you get response flexibility. You get a slower circuit, and you can go, I really want to go, I really want to go, and I'm really going home. Because it can slow it down. Now that's a lot of neurobiology in one little handful, but that's what I'm talking about, that neural integration, these circuits working together, is what determines our quality of life. And that's, again, just one example. You know, we could go through hundreds of examples of where different kinds of breakdowns between the circuits mean that our quality of life, especially relational life, just goes down the tubes. So neural integration is really important. We will support other people's neural integration if we've been able to spot in ourselves where our circuits aren't working so well together, work on healing them, and then we will be so much more easily able to offer that to our clients because we will know where the pathways are. We'll know how we spotted it, and we'll know how we healed it. So that is like forging the trail ahead and then being able to walk with other people down the same trail. Because you can't just do it from a cognitive knowing about it. It just doesn't work because you're not carrying it in your body. And the next time your person gets all wired up with intense emotion, your attachment system is probably going to react in one way or another, and you won't even have a left hemisphere at your disposal at that point. At a certain level of stress, the left hemisphere shuts off. Under anything we perceive as intense stress, the left hemisphere goes offline, and you are working entirely with right hemisphere responses, which are these fast limbic, I need to, and they are good, they're intended for good. I mean, they're the things that let us run away from the saber-toothed tiger and those kinds of things. You know, when you have a predator coming at you, you want to exit as quickly as possible, and you really don't want to shake hands with Joe on the way out to maintain your social connection with him. You want to move very quickly. So these were intended for survival, but right now we still think we're back in cave people days. Our brain does. It hasn't evolved quickly enough, so most of our stresses aren't like that. Many of our stresses are emotional, and our system doesn't really work very well for that unless it's really well integrated. Okay, I'll stop now because I'm starting to go off down a rabbit trail. It won't help us really because it's too much for one thing. Okay, so the next point is that healing and healthy living require the presence of both hemispheres. This is really, really revolutionary because for the last 20 years or so, cognitive behavioral methods have been the most prominent form of therapy, by far the most easy to study because they are, you do A, B, C kinds of things, and then you look at the outcome on the Beck Depression Inventory or whatever, and you have a real clear path of study that's different than long-term therapy. So there's been a lot of study about cognitive behavioral methods, which is mainly left hemisphere talk, trying to have talk modify behavior. Now, as long as stress is moderate and you're in your left hemisphere, that works fine. But the minute stress becomes more intense and the left hemisphere is no longer at your disposal, you're going to go right back to operating out of these rapid limbic responses. So, when we begin instead to take into account that we have two hemispheres and what lives in each hemisphere, and that therapy to change these long-standing patterns begins in the right and then moves to the left, and we support that process in ourselves and in others, then we can get long-lasting change that will hold up even under stress, under severe stress. We kind of learned this, I wouldn't say the hard way, but we learned it really thoroughly in doing parenting with people. Kids, the parents would come in and they'd be so frustrated because Johnny won't do his homework, or Sandy is sassy all the time, or whatever it is. And so at first we had really good parenting programs, and we would help them with all these techniques and everything. And it would look pretty good for 3 or 4 weeks, and then we get a call, our play therapist, parenting person, we get a call at 8 o'clock at night. I get so frustrated, I just threw my kid into the shower, And so she talked through what happened, and all the techniques that she had taught her went out the door because she said to her kids in the car on the way home, to her two, I think they were like 5 and 7 or something, said to them, don't jump on the couch. Kids don't hear don't, so they went in and started jumping on the couch because she had told them to, basically. Because they heard jump on the couch, and their brains went, ooh, that sounds like a really good idea. Not to defy mom, but you say jump on the couch, and their bodies begin to feel what it's like to jump on the couch, and it becomes very compelling to do it because they've been in preschool all day and they really want to do something. So she really, really lost it because she was tired and her stress went up, and so she wound up doing something that was really borderline abusive to these kids, in addition to not feeding them, because this got so out of hand. Well, she had been told that technique of never use the word don't in a sentence like that because but under the stress, it was gone completely, and so she wound up again in the same kind of reactivity. So out of that, we began to go, okay, let's just put all of the parenting programs that we have of do this, that, let's put them in the closet, close the door, and let's begin to work with the parents around their own attachment styles and issues when they come in. Let's see if we can help them repair that so that they have the basic core of connectivity and solidity in their own brains, that they're more stress-proof, and also that they have an experience of being related to with secure attachment. So we retrained our whole staff to do this, not that we were ever that big, but the 10 of us, to do this, and we began to get astonishingly good results. And the parents became less and less interested in specific behaviors and more interested in staying connected to their kids, which meant that then the behaviors improved much more than when they were trying to do charts and stars and all that stuff that we try to do. So that was our experience with that. And we've subsequently been asked by a lot of people to help them revamp their parenting program to take into account really the difficulties that are driving this. It isn't that there are any bad children, It's just parents who are operating out of exactly what they learned as what they were taught as children, what a parent is by their parents. They're just following the patterns that are ingrained. So one of the things then that we can know out of the importance of the right hemisphere stuff is we have to begin to think about how do we incorporate right hemisphere experiential stuff into the training program for new therapists. How does that become a component? Because again, if you don't experience it, it's going to be very, very hard to bring it to life with your clients. And we are going to talk about that. But I'm just throwing it out there as a question. I promise I won't just leave it out there and go, you figure it out. We'll talk about some ways. So then, number 7 is that mindful attention is one key agent of change. Now, we probably think of mindfulness often as doing a mindfulness practice, like breathing practice and all of that. And yeah, that's really, really important. But in the therapy room, mindfulness comes in initially by us being mindful and embracing all of our client within our calm mind. Mindfulness first enters by that path. Then that begins to teach their brain how to be mindful of themselves. And then we may add mindfulness practice of a more formal kind to that mix as well. But the initial mindfulness is us being able to calmly hold in a mindful way and an understanding way the mind and the brain and the body of the person who's there in front of us. So again, it seems like this kind of practice with our own selves, of being able to hold our own selves in this way, would become extremely important to being able to offer that to our clients as they come to us. Mindfulness actually rewires the brain. It begins to draw some of those circuits that we talked about before together. It improves brainwave function. I mean, again, there's pages of bibliography on the advantages of mindfulness for creating an integrated brain as well. Okay, and then the last one is that interpersonal oneness is real and therapist mental health matters. And maybe this should even be number one. So what I mean about interpersonal oneness is that the state of my mind and brain is resonating in your mind and brain right now, doing some subtle rewiring, and the same what I receive from you. Again, a story. Dan Siegel went out to talk to a group of colleagues. They decided they were going to really yank his chain. So there were about 10 of them, all pretty high-level neuroscience people, and they had all agreed they were going to just look down at their papers and never look up while he talked, to break the interpersonal connection. And he did everything but stand on his head to get them to look at him. And Dan's really funny. I don't know how these guys pulled it off, because Dan's hysterically funny. But they managed to keep their heads down, but it got unfunny after a while because his whole mind disintegrated. He became incoherent. He couldn't speak. Because that interpersonal connection was broken, and so there was no resonance, and so his brain was literally on its own, and especially in a situation where he expected resonance. I mean, if you're expecting nobody to talk to you, it's one thing, but if you're expecting it back and forth, and you can't get that to happen, it's very disconcerting for our brains. So we're constantly resonating with one another. Now, to me, this calls for radical responsibility on our part for our own mental health and our own neural integration as we walk into the therapy room. Because what we bring in inside of us, seen and unseen, because this implicit world is largely unseen until we help it be seen, what we bring in is going to have a lot to say about what this person has to resonate with when they're with us. So let's say I can say all kinds of words about hope, but really inside I have a lot of despair about whether therapy actually works. Probably because I have a lot of despair about whether life works, underneath there in the implicit world somewhere. If I'm carrying that kind of well of despair inside of me, I can say all the hopeful words in the world, and my client will pick up and feel the despair and will respond according to that. So we really have to be, I think, consciously, kindly, sweetly aware of our inner world and help it develop as much coherence as possible. Now, that might feel like a burden, but really, every gain we make makes us happier human beings and able to relate better. So everybody wins in this. It's not like it's some, terrible thing. Plus, I think doing therapy then becomes a joy because it becomes a mutually integrated experience. One of my friends said, I would never tell my clients this, but each new client has a better therapist than the last one. Because in the relationship I've had with the just immediately previous person, that has helped to integrate my brain. Because as you feel your clients heal, and as they begin to have more and more integration and better lives, there's a way that we now are resonating in co-resonance with each other, and our brains are coming together more and more as well. So I like that idea a lot, that with each new client, coming at it from this perspective, there's just growth for everybody to be had. There's been so much of a hierarchical model, there's the expert up here, and then there's this poor, broken little person. Well, that really isn't the way that it works, fortunately. There are two human beings that come together. Hopefully we have a little more integration than this person does, and they're coming to us in their pain. At least we have more awareness than they do. But as we come together, we become a partnership and a team, at a very deep level, not at a cognitive level, but at a neural level, we become partners in weaving these circuits together. It becomes this deep and wonderful partnership that just flowers in both people. I'm working with a woman now who just has a horrible, horrible history. And as I'm seeing her, I mean, in some ways she's feeling worse because we're accessing so much painful stuff, but I see her life transforming. I see her sense of herself transforming. I see her asking questions she could never even thought to ask before. And I feel in me this wonderful flow of warmth, oxytocin, bonding chemicals, all this stuff that ties our brains together in such a beautiful way. Just by being present with her, without trying to do anything for me. It just happens. It just happens. So I'd say I did maybe half my recovery in therapy, and the other half has been the result of being with people who recover as we dance these dances together, you know? So if we can get off this hierarchical model, it's also relieving for us. I don't want to be an expert on anything, really. You know, I want to be a partner with people in these discovery processes. And so in this whole neuroscience thing, I felt like, you know, we're kind of the third generation. We had all of these people that did all this research, you know, gigabytes and gigabytes of research, and then people like Dan and Alan who culled that and created these beautiful theories. And now we're in the trenches, all of us together, figuring out how to apply this stuff to make the world a better place, basically, to make the world more capable of compassion and empathy, person to person, person by person. So I feel like we're just all of us. I don't regard myself as an expert at all, but as somebody who's in the trenches with you trying to figure out how to make this stuff work the best it can. Does anybody have a burning question right now? And let me answer a couple questions if there's anything that's milling around in your mind about this stuff. And if there isn't, I'll go on and then we'll take some questions at the end. Anything that's burning?
I think it's where you're headed. I think it's where you're headed. It was under your point about requiring presence of both hemispheres. Having been educated with a real emphasis on left hemisphere, I'm really dying to hear how you talk about integrating both hemispheres in education and training.
Right. That's where I'm headed, exactly. Right. So what would a program look like with the brain in mind? What would a training program look like? Well, the first and most indispensable part is there would have to be an environment created by the school, the professors, the support staff, any therapists that are on staff that, you know, for all of that, that create an environment in which it is safe for students to actually look inside and be with their inner world. In most programs, that's really dangerous because there's no support for it, there's no appreciation for that this is an essential piece, and so people go out in the world with all this buried stuff that probably some of which came up because you can't study all this stuff and not begin to stir around inside. But I know even in what I think was a really good program, there was a lot of burial that happened, you know, where we kind of talk behind our hands to each other, rather than having it be able to be a part of the culture. A part of the narrative of learning is that we're going to do this experiential investigation of what's living inside of me. You know, what do I bring to the table in my relationships out here? Because if I'm doing it out here, I will do it in the therapy room. Maybe not on day one, you know, but at the end of year one, probably, you know, you'll be doing those same things in there. And so there has to be this very nurturing, safe, secure environment that pretty much everybody in the program is on board, that this is what we do, and that it's very overt in terms of what you say about your program, you know, about this program, is that this is part of what we're going to do is nurture personal transformation and make it safe to do that. So that if someone, let's say, were to either dissociate or have a big reaction in class, it would be regarded as a positive event, not as a sign that they shouldn't be a therapist. It would be a positive event. It would be a healing moment. It would be like, okay, this is right where we need to go. And that the professor and other support there, plus hopefully this person then would have a therapist who had some knowledge about this depth kind of stuff, that person would be helped to use this as healing and be kind of a hero because they were brave enough to begin to allow this stuff to happen. And that is not the way it is hardly anywhere at this point. So I think without that environment, it's not fair to ask students to undertake this deep work. I think unless that has happened. So Some of this stuff probably has to happen more slowly because of that, because it takes time to prepare a culture and develop a narrative of what learning to be a therapist is before you can actually do a lot of this. Now, some of this stuff, though, you can do right away. So then, let's say we have this environment, or even without it, there's certainly some things we can do. I think that one of the things, and there are some schools that are doing this now, is that every class ideally would begin with a practice of mindfulness. Every session of every class would devote 5 minutes or so to mindfulness. We know it integrates the brain. We know it prepares the mind to be able to receive others. And there's even a particular kind of meditation that we're going to actually try together a little bit that is particularly conducive to preparing the therapist's mind to be receptive to whatever comes in the room. Now, if you do that over 2 or 3 years with every single class, I would suspect that most people will begin to do it every day for themselves as well, because it feels really good once you get even a little bit good at it. You know, once you get a little bit of experience under your belt, and you begin even with that to build much more integrated brains and have a better life. So that's one piece that can be put in place anytime, any place anybody has the will to do it and the buy-in from, you know, you can't have staff that thinks it's stupid and have it get very far. But if you have staff and professors and all that support this, it is something you can do. So let me invite you to just do this for a couple minutes with me and get a little flavor of it. So I'm going to invite you to just sit with feet flat on the floor. That seems to help kind of line things up to do this. And we're going to just do one practice for about 2 minutes, and then we're going to open it out and do a second practice, and then I'll talk about it a little bit. Okay. So then just kind of get your body comfortable, and just notice if you can relax your shoulders and your hands. And then if you're comfortable with it, just allowing your eyes to close. And we're just going to pay attention to the sensation of the breath in the nostrils, or the rise and fall of your chest, or the rise and fall of your belly. Whatever feels most comfortable to you. So just notice the inhalation and the exhalation, but staying with the sensation of it. And when your mind drifts away, which it will, with great kindness, just bring it back again to noticing the breath. To just invite you to let go of your focus on the breath, and then just feel as though your whole being can open to receive anything that's happening in your body, your thoughts, your feelings, anything that comes in from the outside world, any sounds, the breeze in the room, whatever it is, the feeling of your body in the chair. And just receive all of that into a non-judgmental space, just allowing each thing to be there. And again, when the mind wanders, just bring it gently back to that receptivity. And then just taking a slightly deeper breath as you exhale, just come back out into the outside world again. Do you feel the difference in the room? I mean, we practice very little time. You feel the shift? That's integrative neuroplasticity. That's being able to use the mind's focus to shift the way the brain's firing. And when you do it over and over again, you build up those neural circuits so that you can tap into this state anytime. So those two are very powerful because we want to strengthen our capacity to attend to one thing. We like this, having this kind of clear focus and being able to stay with it. That's what the first part of that meditation does. And then on the foundation of that, when we open into receptivity, we can allow whatever our clients bring or whatever our own mind brings to come into this very stable space. So the first part creates the stability, and then you move into receptivity. And if you do that over and over and over again, you'll find you begin to go into every session with maybe just unconsciously even taking a couple of breaths to get the stability and then opening into receptivity as you open the door with a big smile and say, I'm so glad to see you, or whatever. But they'll come into this space that invites their mind to settle and open whatever needs to happen next. So again, this is something any program could put into place tomorrow, if they chose to. And also, interestingly enough, you do this at the beginning of class, it creates a much better learning environment for the brain. So you actually get more bang for the buck even for left hemisphere learning if you do this prior to engaging and pouring a lot of data into the brain. Okay, so that's one thing. I think that that's like the foundation. The second foundation is that if I were designing a program, I would want every person to have a listening partner who they would walk through the program with, where they would listen to one another. And their only purpose was not to be a therapist at all, but to be a place where this person could come and talk about anything, betcha, anything that was going on. And practice the practice of listening. When we feel received, our own mind deepens and reveals more. And if this person were to run into difficulties as a result of doing this, hopefully this program would also have wonderful resources of therapists who understand this kind of healing that they could refer, so there'd be deep resources for the students if they begin to run into trouble. But this capacity to talk to one another in a deep way and to develop this relationship over a couple of years is really kind of the hallmark of interpersonal neurobiology. Our brains weave together so much better in relationship than they do when we're out there thinking by ourselves or feeling by ourselves. It's the nature of that resonance that it weaves the brains together from the beginning of life. The mothering person is creating brain structure those first 2 years in her baby. It's just so exciting. And such a big responsibility, because literally brain structure is being woven in. So we have a huge impact on one another. So I would love to see there be these wonderful listening partnerships of very safety. And again, it doesn't require any skill except the willingness to be present and listen to one another. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that each class would include the neurobiology of whatever's being talked about. So let's say it's a class on couples therapy. And one of the questions becomes, okay, when two people meet and move toward intimacy, what neural circuitry is lighting up in there? What's going on? What kind of neural circuits? And then the answer would be, well, the attachment circuits are going to light up. And then the question would be, well, what are those? And how do we be with people to help those circuits become healthier? What do we know from science about how to be with that circuitry? So again, you get a more and more refined sense of what's actually going on in the brain. Not just big general ideas, but a very refined, clear sense of when two people are fighting all the time, what's different in the brain than when two people are ignoring each other all the time. It's an entirely different brain pattern that calls for an entirely different kind of presence and way of being with the people. And once you can really see that, you have so much more ability to position yourself in a way to help neural integration happen around that and to talk to your clients about what's going on in their brain. So now, these two people that are fighting, it's no longer a characterological issue where each says you're just a big jerk. It's now a neurobiological issue that they can be curious about why does our limbic system get so wired up that we lose contact with each other. Totally different than you're a big jerk. you know? And so you begin to be able to help couples build teams where they're looking at their own brains and each other's brains and nurturing change. Now, it doesn't happen in one session. You know, they'll still be fighting 2 months from now sometimes. But they begin to catch themselves and go, this doesn't feel nearly as good as being curious about what's going on in our brains that we feel a need to fight about what we're having for dinner, which is a stupid fight anyway, you know? And so they begin to catch themselves more and more. Yeah? I have 5 minutes. Oh, I think I'm allowed to wander off a little longer than that. Okay. So learning in very refined ways about the brain, I think, is really important. And then side by side with that is not only learning about other people's brains, but in that same class, as we're learning about these circuits of intimacy, we're also going, and how do I respond in intimate situations? And we're beginning to sense, how's my brain wired up about that? And talking to the listening partner and the therapist and having very safe conversations in class where a person can say, I lose it with my 3-year-old about every other day, and I'm curious now about what's going on in my brain around that, and how can I help that? How can I change that? So that we have the experiential right hemisphere piece side by side, interwoven intimately with the left hemisphere piece. Because there's a tendency right now, everybody wants to know about the brain. So there is a class on brain science over here somewhere. And then everybody else is still talking, well, here's the marital therapy class, and here's the child therapy class, and here's the... And so, sorry. Ooh, I didn't mean to attack the microphone. So nothing ever gets really integrated, even at the neuroscience level with the other things that are being learned, much less with the personal level, which is where the rubber meets the road when you're a therapist, is how does this stuff live inside of me? What causes my sympathetic to go into overactivation? How do I calm that down? What's that pattern like for me? Where did I learn that? And so again, it becomes curiosity, and again, it's not characterological, it's neurobiological. There's not something wrong with you. You have brain wiring that's causing you to do a certain thing that we can now work on changing. So it removes this what's wrong with you thing from the whole endeavor of therapy and puts it in a whole different perspective of this is the way your brain got wired up, and now we can change that. Just giving that information, I have seen people come up out of shame where they feel like, oh, I'm the worst human being in the planet, and come up into contact with me as the therapist, being able to say, now let's look at how we can change this, because this isn't about you being a bad guy. You shook your child because of this, this, and this. And I've literally seen people not be able to look at me, and I start doing the hand model down where I'm in the line of sight down here, so they can't help but kind of see it even though they're looking at the floor. And gradually they come up as they begin to connect. And meanwhile, their hand over here, unbeknownst to them, is paralleling what mine is doing. Bodies getting unison. They begin to feel seen, and then they can begin to hear. Because a person in shame is not hearing anything you're saying in any way that's meaningful. They can't take anything in. Think about when you felt ashamed. Are you taking anything in from the outside? There's just this burying that goes on when we do that. So this deepening of the awareness of our own inner landscape, and especially around attachment. And then the last thing is this. The other thing that I would love to see nourished in all programs is self-kindness and gentleness, self-compassion. I teach at Portland State sometimes, and we were talking about compassion, and toward clients and all that, and then we talked about, well, how about if we did a practice of self-compassion? And this lady literally stood halfway up out of her seat. She said, I never thought of applying that to myself. And I think it's so often the case, especially if we have a lot of internalized critical voices that are busy gnawing on our heads, and we're raised in a society that's all progress and performance, and I mean, it's almost impossible not to have internalized some of that harshness toward ourselves, and often toward others too, but we can sometimes be really kind to other people and still be being really mean and judgmental and critical inside. So again, from the first day of the program, to begin to do a compassion meditation that really is just radiating, may you be well, may you be safe, may you be happy, to our whole inner being. And doing that every day. In the Buddhist tradition from which this comes, people are not allowed to do that for other people till they've been doing it for themselves for anywhere from 3 months to 3 years. Because until we soften inside, it's very hard to have an integrated sense of softness for people on the outside. So that's something else that would be wonderful to conclude every class. because probably during the course of the class, it's like, I didn't get that, I didn't understand that, I must be dumb, you know. Or the other flip side, I got all of that, I'm so smart. That's the flip side of I'm so dumb, and has no equanimity in it either, and has the same effect on the autonomic nervous system of making the sympathetic really go up, because now we have to live up to that and be that smart forever. That's why they're finding that praising kids doesn't really work when you're praising what they've done, because it makes them feel very insecure about what happens when I don't do that. So that whole view is changing as far as parenting goes too, but that's another day's issue. But just to do that, just even to place the hand on the heart. In fact, let's do that together for a minute. One or both hands, if you're comfortable doing that. And if you're not, you don't have to. But then, again, radiating to the inner world, just saying whatever words that are like, may you be well, may you be peaceful, may you be at rest, may you be comforted. Whatever words feel like it's what your inner world needs in that moment. And again, taking a little deeper breath and just releasing back into the outside world. There's something so soft and gentle about that, and I work with that with most of my clients at some point or other when it seems right. And I have this one man that he would put his hand near his heart, and he would feel all the energy drain into his elbow. He couldn't touch his heart. He was hated by his parents, and so that self-hatred that generated from that was so deep that he literally could not extend even a physical touch, much less say any words about it. So one of the things we began to watch is as the energy retreated less when we would do this from time to time, just as kind of to see how things were going in there. So it's a powerful thing with clients too, but it'll be more powerful if we're doing it also. So the big takeaway is that I think that we all deserve, us old guys included, to live in kind environments that support our constant transformation. And that as therapists currently practicing or therapists in the making, that it's essential for our long-term well-being as therapists that this begin to be nurtured more, step by step, step by step. So thank you very much for having me here today.
I have a question regarding, because I haven't done it a whole lot, the receptivity portion of the breathing exercise. Could you elaborate more on the receptivity? What are you receptive to?
Sure. Yeah, it's a very visceral feeling, almost like becoming a big bowl or something, and then anything that comes up in the body, just noticing it, thinking, like if I was doing that and sitting down, I might notice the feeling of my bottom on the chair, for example, or I might feel an itchy nose, so body things, and just acknowledging it. Oh, my nose itches, But again, from this observing, compassionately caring, observing point of view of incorporating it, not observing it as though it's over there, but like, oh, that's a part of me. And then hearing sounds like there were some sounds that were happening out there, and just hearing them come in and just receiving them into this big bowl of awareness with this calm, peaceful, compassionate sense. And that's the state we want to be in when our clients come into the room, because that tells them it's safe to bring whatever you next need to bring. Now, the great ally is that our brains are always trying to integrate. They are constantly on a quest to integrate. They are complex systems pushing toward integration. If you give them room to do it, they will do it. You have a great ally in your client, because the brain is pushing toward integration. So that's why I am probably the least directive therapist on the face of the earth, unless someone tells me they're going to jump off a bridge in the next 10 minutes. Because what I've found works the best is to work on my receptivity so that they bring what we need to work on next, and then I go with them where they need to go. Because their brain knows where they need to go next, if there's room to do it. But if I'm busy directing and poking and challenging and being scared and all that stuff, their brain doesn't stand a chance. It's not a safe environment. So that's why I like that particular meditation. But if you don't do the breathing first, you kind of don't have that stability, and you can get pulled off to all these, you aren't really receiving. You're kind of like, oh, there's a noise. Oh, there's an itch. Instead of receiving all of those things and just holding them.
We were talking earlier about mindfulness vis-a-vis mindlessness.
Yeah.
And I've thought about this over the years as a student and as a teacher. I wonder if you might comment on how to encourage as well for our learners here at CalSouthern to practice mindlessness. And I mean something specifically by that, by creating a space maybe for creativity, for experiencing beauty, love for sure, but just a word about that.
Sure.
You know.
Well, it turns out mindfulness integrates the brain. It turns out that even if you're not doing that, your brain's trying to integrate all the time, because there's a default network that runs through your brain this direction, that's constantly picking up all the new information and integrating it with what's already there without you ever being aware of it. And except when you're in deep sleep, it's on all the time. So your brain is really working at integration all the time. It works hardest when you are mindless, meaning daydreaming or doing something creative. When you're not having directed attention, it gets even a little bit more. So for people who struggle with mindfulness, it's always good to be able to tell them that their mindlessness is also giving their brain room to do its integrative work. So that's how determined our brains are to get better, too, which to me as a therapist means I don't have to work nearly so hard. I just have to be able to provide an environment to let happen what wants to happen, you know? So, yeah, so creativity and relaxation and daydreaming and all of those things are never a waste of time. Now, if that's all you're doing, that's a different issue. But I mean, this balance between focus and relaxation of focus is a very healthy thing. Well, it was a very interesting experience because it was talk about being one tiny step ahead of the people you're trying to teach. Because I had, when I first started to talk about this stuff, I only had the vaguest notion from hearing Dan talk one time at one conference. And I came back like, this is the best stuff in the world. And they're used to me being a little crazy that way. So they kind of went, yeah. But then they started to get enthusiastic too. So what happened over those 5 years was my brain got more and more refined around the neuroscience, and they were able to do that. I began to be able to talk about what was happening with my clients as a result of what was changing in me, and me talking to them about their brains. And so then they were resonating with me about that. So then they began to start to really read. Dan's book, The Developing Mind, is not an easy book. However, I was forced to read it with great attention because we taught this to Dan. There were 20 of us that taught this book to Dan. And that was the setup of the class, and we didn't know what part of it we were going to teach till a week before we taught him. So, not wanting to look like a jackass, I became a very close student of this book. It made all the difference in the world. It's one of the best things I've ever done. Because again, it took this broad kind of diffuse sense about the brain and really refined it down to this is what this circuit does under these circumstances. And then I began watching it in myself. And watching it in myself. And then obsessively talking about it to my family, who's still with me, in spite of it. You know, I'll talk to anybody about anything, just like, but began to speak it also, and all of that, and it began to be more integrated, and then they began to do the same thing. So as they saw that happening for me, all of them read the book, I think. They said they did. I don't know if they really did. Who knows what anybody really does. But certainly all of us together were having both this more refined awareness within ourselves and then bringing it to our clients. And then it just became a cycle that got deeper and deeper, and this compassion, this sense of compassion in the room when we would talk about our clients. A lot of that kind of sick emergency room humor sort of stuff, you know, kind of faded away a lot. It just wasn't needed to bleed off the tension anymore. And I'd kind of enjoyed it. I mean, I certainly was not adverse to us, you know, saying really terrible things from time to time, because it's, you know, can be a healthy thing. But it just kind of wasn't there very much anymore. And so because there was just, and we'd have these quiet moments where we were just together kind of holding a client or a family, all of us in their mind, and then somebody would say something about it, but there was a sense of being present with them, whoever this person brought in. And then the interns kept saying, well, now when I go in there, I don't feel like I'm alone either. You're all with me. I feel your presence with me when I'm working with this really upset situation. So there was all this interpersonal integration and internalization that was going on as well. So we looked at each other one day after supervision and said, we did it. And we all got tearful. It was like, oh, that was like a whole 2.5 hours where we really were in that state together. And we weren't always like that, there was that day. So then I had study group that day. I went and told Dan, and he got a tear in his eye. So that was a really nice closing of the circle, because we more and more felt like Dan was in the room with us, too. And now when I work with people, I have Dan, and now I've been studying with Alan Shore a lot, so now I got Dan and Alan with me. And I spent time with Steve Porges about the nervous system, so now I feel more and more this incorporation of these other beings, their presence, you know, not just the left hemisphere knowledge, but their presence. So, like that. It was great fun. Plus, we didn't expect anybody to be perfect at it, including me, which was very helpful. Any other thoughts? Well, I thank you all so much. It was really a great pleasure to be here, and to everybody out there also. I didn't greet you at the beginning. I apologize for that, but I certainly greet you now and say thank you for being here. And it's very nice atmosphere here. Thank you.
Thanks so much.